Hey everyone, I'm Alex from Cytonox, and today I'll be ranking the bosses of The Legend of Zelda Skyward Sword from worst to best. Before that, however, I've got a few announcements. First off, I'd like to thank you all for helping us reach 10,000 subscribers. That's me blowing a party favor there. 5 digits, that's quite a few Cytoscribers. I'd love to do something special for the occasion, especially considering Jack and I move out to our respective colleges in around a month's time, so feel free to drop ideas for anything you'd want to see. I'm also heading out on a trip for South Korea for a little while, so I'll be MIA for about 2 weeks after this video goes live. Anyways, that's all the immediate pressing news on our front. As all 954 of you faithful Zelda content viewers know, I last ranked the dungeons of Skyward Sword and promised to give my thoughts on the bosses next time around. Well, here we are. This is one of those games that has quality all over the place, good, bad, and ugly. Let's get into it. Hoo boy. You know, the phrase good, bad, and ugly never made a ton of sense to me. In my head, ugly always just meant extremely bad or something. Going off my scale, then, the Imprisoned is definitely ugly. It's bosses like this that make me wonder who on earth could have thought it was a good idea. I've heard horror stories from game developers of higher-ups belligerently forcing in weird ideas. Maybe that's the case here. It's absolutely beyond me. There are definitely times where fighting a boss multiple times has been cool. Take Metroid Prime 2 or Devil May Cry. The key element here is that the boss in question is enjoyable and cool, and not groan-inducing rubbish. I have seen a lot in my time making ranking videos. I've seen people defend Rumor Honeybottoms. I've seen people defend the Dragon God. I've even seen Ronald Rocket defend, well, pretty much anything under the sun that Jack stands against. But never in my life have I come across someone who thinks of the Imprisoned as anything more than an unwelcome nuisance. If I had any hand in creating this thing, I would have converted to Catholicism and spent 6 hours a day in a confession booth paying penance for bringing this abomination into being. It is inconceivable to me that someone could create this and not be racked with guilt, shame, and self-loathing. Every second I've ever spent trimming his toenails and getting molested by shockwaves is a second of my life wasted. This process is, of course, broken up by the most boring running sequence since Punk Hazard. To say the Gruesinator being present makes up for it is like saying you could murder my family and square it up with a fruit basket. I'm sure at least one person will come to the defense of the Imprisoned for whatever reason, and all I can say is we gotta agree to disagree on this one, man. If there's one thing this game is infamous for, it's the motion controls. While the Switch port graciously granted players the option to avoid this game-ruining gimmick, its hateful specter still lingers in some aspects of the game. Enter the Girahim boss fights. From a story point of view, he's pretty entertaining, at least so I'll give him that. Of his many end-of-dungeon appearances, all of them have dialogue that balances his elegance with his sadism, which is a combination I find rather amusing. Otherwise, it's a confusing, unintuitive pain in the ass to fight him. It's a pretty drawn-out fight if you're trying to figure it out for the first time, thanks to him being able to deprive you of your sword and block it with his dark hand. Your main goal of juking him out and slashing him from the side he isn't guarding is something that might work if it was in For Honor, or some other game with directional aiming that actually works, but here I was a total fish out of water. This fight is definitely a step up from the Imprisoned, and if it controlled well, I think it'd be fine, but I just cannot get things to work out smoothly, which makes it a hassle more than anything else. I bet you expected a cool boss at the end of the Fire Sanctuary, didn't you? A dragon, maybe, like you'd seen decorating the dungeon's walls? Nope, just another janky duel with RuPaul. Like the last time, you're mostly swatting his daggers out of the air and countering, although this time he's a little more tricky with his dagger patterns and gets 2 swords to block you instead of 1 when he hits the second phase. By this point in the game, you probably understand the controls a lot better, so it's far less frustrating than the initial encounter despite being extremely similar. Like I said of his first fight, it's definitely not a boss that I'd call bad, but the sheer disappointment of not getting a new unique boss for this otherwise cool dungeon put a permanent damper in my opinion of this fight. I just know I'm bound to rustle some jimmies with this claim. If you love this boss, I can totally get it. Demise undeniably looks cool and has a pretty interesting arena. Fighting the first ever incarnation of Ganondorf also adds a lot of heft to the story side of things. However, despite this, I find Demise absolutely miserable from a gameplay perspective. This is largely because I was going into the fight with a measly 6 or so hearts. Before you rush to the comments to moan, "Oh Alex, you're just a moron for getting in that position in the first place, you should have brought more potions or something," let me just give you a rough overview of my thought process going into it. The rest of the game was never that hard. I figured I could probably make it through the final stretch without bringing potions into it and all that jazz, considering how rarely I ever needed them in any of the other games. I beat Final Girahim and come out barely alive. I can't go back because the game is saved at that point. Only one way I can move, and that's forwards. Critical health be damned. What can you do? For such a big lunk, he's pretty quick with that sword, quick enough to kill me loads of times with my handicap anyways. The only solution I found was to slash at him twice or so and then backflip, repeating this dull but stressful loop for about a minute and a half until he enters phase 2. Visually, this part is awesome. However, his dash attack is total bullshit, and the only reliable method of beating him I found here is trying to stunlock him with the supercharged Skyward strikes and pray to the RNG gods he takes it like a chump. Using your shield supposedly trivializes this fight, but I always found the controls for the shield in this game really wonky and hard to use, so I never was able to get much use out of it. I will give credit where credit is due. The finishing blow is awesome, as it often is in Zelda final boss fights, I've noticed. This, Wind Waker, and Twilight Princess have pretty cool ones at least. I don't know. I'm not going to call this fight objectively bad because a great degree of my distaste for this fight seems to come from user error, but I'd still rather lick a porta potty clean with my tongue than ever put myself through this repetitive, frustrating nightmare ever again. Here we are, the first normal boss on the list. Skaldera is, like most Zelda bosses you fight in the dungeon where you get access to bombs, prone to opening his mouth for prolonged periods of time and vacuuming everything in sight. Just one of those Nintendo game things you don't question, like why space pirates build morph ball tunnels in all their bases. As usual, hucking lethal explosives into the mouth of a ferocious creature is good fun, supplemented by watching him tumble down the bone ramp like a bowling ball. Follow this up with some eyeball slashing and you've got a quintessential Zelda boss right there. The way you have to hit his eye in the spots where the rock chunks have been blown off is a rare instance of the controls actually being sorta neat, which I appreciate. It's a bit boring when you're just waiting for him to open himself up, but that's a pretty forgivable crime for a second boss. Skaldera isn't groundbreaking, well, unless the rocks on him are from the ground, then I guess he literally is, but regardless, I've never been fighting him and had any negative thoughts on the experience. Yet another solid use of the control scheme. You might be noticing a trend here. When the penalty for incorrectly using the awkward movement isn't a swift death, it actually works sort of well, who'da thunk. This boss nails a lot of bullet points in the checklist for what makes a good Zelda boss. It uses the dungeon item well, which is especially impressive considering the general lack of combat utility for the Gust Bellows. It's satisfying, cool, and doesn't overstay its welcome or die too fast. I also like how when you declaw him, you just gotta poke his eyes. It's nice finally getting a use out of that move. There is another fight with him in the overworld for some reason, which is something I always find lame in games because it cheapens the original boss fight by not making it feel one of a kind. That aside, the fight is a solid by-the-number Zelda boss that has no issues in particular. Fighting on the Loft Wing, surprisingly it works pretty smoothly. This is a boss fight I didn't see coming at all considering it happens outside of a dungeon, making it a rather unique encounter in the greater scheme of the series. This poor sky whale Levias here is infested with a parasite, something I imagine must be absolutely horrifying. I remember when I was a wee little kid, my dad used to live in this shithole apartment full of cockroaches, and my biggest fear was that while I was showering, one of them would try to jump up my asshole and lay a nest inside me. Very gruesome thought for a 7-year-old, huh? Anyways, the Loft Wing portion is only the beginning of the fight, but the real meat is when you skydive down onto his back. From there you get to play, guess what? Projectile tennis. Never change, Zelda games. You can damage Bill of Sight with Skyward Strikes as well. If you're feeling sportsmanlike though, you just reflect his spike balls back into his fins and lone eyeball respectively. This fight has a spectacle advantage in just about everybody other than Demise and maybe the final Gear him fight, and solid gameplay to boot. For this mixture of good traits, I deem this officially pretty good. At last, Girahim gets a fight that's worthy of his character. This fight is awesome and one of the most creative without a doubt. He's totally invulnerable this time around, so your only recourse is forcing him out of the ring sumo style, which is very fun if a bit too easy. Seriously, look at this. You can absolutely bully the poor guy. After a long series of very dramatic fatal blows to the chest, you can attack a crystal in his torso, which is how you finally do him in. He puts up an actual fight once you're this far in, and this is where I got stunted on prior to my fight with Demise. The first phase really lulled me into a false sense of security. This part is definitely the best technical sword fight in the game and feels the least gimmicky. He's got a solid pool of attacks and nothing felt unfair or frustrating. The difficulty distribution is really wonky, but otherwise this was an amazing fight and I found it to be by far the most enjoyable part of the finale, along with the insane Hyrule Warrior style hack and slash portion preceding it. Sometimes I feel like the only guy on Earth who likes this boss. All I ever see regarding Tantalus discussion are Monsters Inc. comparisons and mockery. Does he look goofy? Sure. But you know what this fight also is? Surprisingly fun and memorable, at least for me. I knew I was in for a treat when the fight started off with a whole sequence about the ship going through a storm and flooding. Never have I seen a boss fight in a Zelda game heralded by an actual impact on the environment. Storms are awesome, that's just common knowledge. Anyways, cleanly hacking through tentacles is real satisfying to me, and getting a nice big eyeball to chop up afterwards is even better. Shooting his eye to get him down is par for the course, but at least you have to actually aim instead of just auto-targeting like in some other games, so it's not totally brain dead. For some weird reason, Tantalus shares the theme with Scaldera. I always find it a bit lame when bosses share themes in games, but it's not a huge deal. Tantalus is fun and has an actual build-up to get you excited, which is a neat novelty. I'm a fan, sue me. Enough hot takes. Here's one so common it might as well be an objective opinion at this point. Kolokto's design is amazing. It blows literally every other boss in the game out of the water in terms of originality and awesomeness. And of course, as is often the case, a Zelda boss is only as good as its dungeon item weakness. In this case, Koloktos is up against the whip, one of the most interesting additions to Link's arsenal of the newer games by a long shot, haha. Here you gotta use the whip to dismember his arms one by one, yanking him off his torso. Gnarly. If that wasn't cool enough for you, the fight has a second phase where you get to use his own giant swords on him. It's even got a Metal Gear Rising style dismemberment system where depending on where you slash him, some limbs get lopped off. Of course, that's helpful, but your main goal is busting open his chest and destroying his core. It's everything you could really want in a dungeon boss. Great item usage, looks great, good fun. For those reasons, I'd call Koloktos the uncontestable best boss in Skyward Sword. Thanks so much for watching, and I hope you enjoyed. This brings an end to my series on Skyward Sword, but the other 3D Zelda games will be covered in due time as well. Next on the list is Wind Waker, starting with the dungeons. Be sure to tune in down the road when I put that out. That's all for now. Deuces.